Shabbat Shalom. In late February of 2020, Kelly and I joined 11 other couples, all rabbis and their partners or spouses, on a 9-day trip to Egypt. This seems hard to fathom even now. We visited just days before pandemic lockdown, openly as a Jewish group, with an Israeli travel company, meeting with most of the remaining Jews left in Cairo, and learning about Egypt's efforts at the time to cultivate Jewish and specifically Israeli tourism by pouring millions of dollars into the restoration of historic synagogues. At the time of our visit, there were 8 officially recorded Jewish residents of Cairo. In 1948, upon the establishment of the State of Israel, Egypt had between 75 and 80,000 Jews, most of whom were expelled beginning in the 1950s, a fate similar to that of most Jews from Arab lands. For these reasons, to say nothing of blood and frogs and lice, oh my, I approached this trip with hesitation bordering on trepidation. Little did we know that we had more to fear from an invisible virus than from other threats, either real or imagined, like terrorism or mummies' tombs. Still, for this rabbi, the very mention of Egypt called up all sorts of associations, most of them bad. Is any other place on earth called the house of bondage? Don't answer that. I recalled the Torah's admonitions never to go back to Egypt, where our people were ruthlessly enslaved at mortar and brick. But I figured a chance like this doesn't come around every day. So Kelly and I boarded a plane and we were off. What we discovered in Egypt dispelled my anxieties and opened my eyes. We encountered a complex, vibrant, and wounded society, still reeling from the failed Arab Spring of a decade prior, which precipitated the overthrow of the despot Hosni Mubarak, and shortly thereafter the subsequent coup d'etat that ousted his successor, Mohamed Morsi, who had violently suppressed the protest movement. Even now, under Mohamed al-Sisi, Egypt remains a repressive military dictatorship with a third of its people living in crushing poverty. And yet we also experienced a society of generous hospitality, kindness, and openness to tourists, yes, Jewish tourists, and at least between government officials, a real partnership between Egyptians and Israelis, particularly where security matters are concerned. Egypt has remained Israel's most steadfast and important regional partner, with whom a stable peace has been preserved for 45 years. My time in Egypt certainly informed how I think about Egyptians, who feature at the center of this week's Torah reading, Parshat Va'era, the second portion in the book of Exodus, and who, at the same time, are decentered from that narrative, in that the story is told from the Israelites' perspective, and we never really hear what the Egyptians are thinking or feeling. The Parsha depicts the first 7 plagues against Egypt, a contest of escalating violence between the God of the Hebrews and the Pharaoh, his court, and all the gods of Egypt, with the objective of freeing the captive Israelites from Pharaoh's ruthless terror regime. Unmentioned, but surely present, were the countless Egyptians enduring a horrific bombardment which brings to their territory widespread destruction of property, the death of cattle and livestock, a shortage of food and potable water, outbreaks of vermin and disease, a terrifying rain of fiery hail from the skies. And that's just this week's Parsha. Next week will come the locusts and the darkness and the death of the firstborn. In any case, I have thought a lot in recent days about these ordinary Egyptians, and I have taken a liberty that rabbis tend to take, which is to read the Torah not only at the level of pshat, the surface or plain sense of the text, but also at the level of drash or midrash, imagining the story in between the lines of the text. I wondered, what the Egyptian masses in between the lines of our story felt about the unrelenting assault on home and property and health and life. Terror, certainly, but what else? Bewilderment, impotence, rage, and if rage, at whom? Did they blame Pharaoh and his courtiers for getting them into this mess in the first place? Did they blame Pharaoh for his stated aim to commit genocide against the Hebrews, issuing a policy of drowning them in the Nile? Did they blame their own taskmasters for brutalizing the Hebrew slaves? Or did these ordinary Egyptians believe that they were all just following orders? I imagine that the vast majority of Egyptians lived far from Israelite settlements and did not see themselves as in any way complicit with their suffering, any more than the average Israelite saw him or herself as complicit in all the hell of plagues inflicted on their enemy. And yet the average Egyptian surely suffered inordinately, while Pharaoh and his company enjoyed the luxury of palace life. Did the Egyptians blame the Hebrews for settling in their land under Joseph many generations earlier? When Moses demands again and again, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh refuses again and again, his heart, as we have heard, hardening to the plight of the captives, how did that play on the Egyptian street? From what I saw of Egyptian archaeology in February of 2020, I can confidently state that ancient Egypt was not an open society. The Pharaoh ruled supreme as a living god among the people. I'm sure public protest was not tolerated in Egypt, so it's hard to know how ordinary Egyptians felt about Hebrew slavery at all, given that they were no less subjects to Pharaoh's iron-fisted rule, whose lives mattered little, if at all, to their autocratic tyrant. Do imagine that these ordinary Egyptians, embittered by life and indoctrinated by their state-sponsored belief system to worship death, probably carried a deep and pervasive sense of victimhood. I wonder all this about the Egyptians, and my questions at the end of the day continue to go unanswered. The text gives us only what it gives, the words on the page and the blank spaces in between to ask questions and imagine all the untold stories. We call this midrash. But there are other Jewish texts, important texts, both within the Torah and beyond it, that invite us to recognize that despite the fact that the Egyptians were our enemies, and despite the fact that for us to demand freedom from captivity and terror was just, both in cause and in means, even through the use of force, the Egyptians nevertheless were still human beings, and they were suffering human beings at that. Even in the hell of war, Judaism does not give us license to dehumanize the enemy. Even one's enemy is a human being made in the image of God, we are taught. And so when the 10 plagues are recounted at the Pesach Seder, we spill a drop of wine in acknowledgement that the fruit of our joy and the cup of our liberation is diminished by the suffering of the Egyptians. And the Talmud affirms that God does not rejoice in the defeat of the enemy, even portraying God as chastising the angels for wanting to sing while the Egyptians were drowning in the sea. And this is the Torah's own directive. Lo t'ta'ev mitzri ki ger hayita ba'artzo. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a stranger in his land. I would be remiss not to conclude on this Shabbat with words by Reverend Martin Luther King. On the subject of loving our enemies, a notion deeply embedded in Christian thought but not emphasized in Judaism, actually deeply uncomfortable in relationship to Judaism, King delivered a sermon at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama on November 17th, 1957, that offers a little food for thought for this Jewish setting at this Jewish moment. In the final analysis, King said, "Love is not this sentimental something that we talk about. Love is not merely an emotional something. Love is creative, understanding goodwill for all men. It is the refusal to defeat any individual. When you rise to the level of love, he said, of its great beauty and power, you seek not to defeat any individual man, but rather to defeat evil systems. O God, he prayed in conclusion, help us in our lives and in all our attitudes to work out this controlling force of love, this controlling power that can solve every problem that we confront in all areas. Amen.